Kia ora. I'm not going to take you through my journey through New Zealand, but let me just say I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for organizing these events. They're so important for us as researchers, teachers, doctoral students, practitioners to get together and actually learn with and from each other. And I'm absolutely pleased to be here today. Before I, can people hear me all right? Before I go into the journey for this afternoon, I would like to start with these two quotes, and I would invite you to read them. These are two quotes taken from a fairly recent research project. The project was about, well, organizing conversations with families and practitioners about their experiences in early childhood programs. And here's a father, and here's a teacher, and that's what they say. We can do a quick sort of brainstorming exercise. Would you have any suggestions where these two voices might have been recorded? Europe and Asia? And
Europe, Africa.
Okay, thank you. Any other ideas, quick suggestions? They could be happening here. Quite often when I introduce these two quotes to an audience not familiar with our field, I get quite interesting suggestions. People say, oh, that's Bangladesh or Uganda. And then somebody says, but maybe that's Auckland or just up in Queens, or it could be East London. These two quotes have been recorded in a research project in the heart of Europe, in a member state of the European Union, Croatia, and they are voices of a father and a teacher of a Roma community in the northern part of Croatia, in Međimurje County, asked about their experiences in an early childhood program set up with a lot of European money. They could have chosen to talk about the immediate interactions between the practitioners and the children, resources in the classroom, what's happening on a Tuesday morning, relationships. They chose to talk about the context for growing up in one of the most affluent regions of this world. Why is this important? I would like to try and get through 3 steps with you this afternoon. First of all, talk a bit about the changing context for working in early childhood education, care, and development, and how that context is changing on a global scale, and why that might be important for us to notice. In the second step, I would like to point out in a bit more detail the machinations of what I call, borrowing from Deleuze, the desiring machine that early childhood has become. And then, time allowing, and you have to start throwing things at me if I wander off, I would like to talk about the pockets of resistance and the possible old and new alliances, and this is where Froebel comes into the picture, that we might engage in order to position ourselves in relation to these global developments. That's the plan. So Why is it important to listen to voices like the ones of the father and the teacher in Međimurje County in Croatia, in Europe? There is a growing realization that growing up under conditions of poverty and exclusion has become a reality for an increasing number of children. And I say Europe here, but you can replace Europe with many other parts of the so-called developed world. The experience of being marginalized is no longer something that's confined to the margins, neither geographically nor socially in our societies. It happens as we speak around us. Of course, some countries, and this is particularly true if you look at the context of the European Union over the last couple of years, some countries are much more affected than others by policies, mostly austerity policies, well, shaped by my good old friend Tina. Tina is, there is no alternative. Roberto Unger, the Brazilian writer, talks about the dictatorship of no alternatives that suggests that there's only one way of doing policy, that there can be no space for public debate about alternatives, and the approaches that countries take can simply not be questioned. So some countries are much more affected by austerity policies than others, and there are some excellent reports out there, including the 2015 Crisis Monitoring Report that documents in detail the implications for young children of these policies in countries like Greece and Portugal and other countries in Europe. The experience of poverty and exclusion have become a new normality across Europe, including the most affluent countries, and this is why there is an example from a fairly recent report about the United Kingdom, the country where I work and live at the moment, talking about 1 in 5 children in this country that is a member of the G7, the club of the most wealthy economies on this planet. 1 in 5 children living in cold and damp conditions, 1 in 10 lacking warm clothes in winter, 1 in 20 growing up suffering from hunger and malnutrition. So third world conditions, what we used to call arrogantly third world conditions, are happening all around us and have become a new normality for many children. There's a second aspect that shapes the context of working with young children on a macro scale in Europe, but also in many other countries. In 2015, more than 1 million people, refugees and migrants, have come to Europe through very dangerous routes, mostly fleeing violence and war in countries like Syria, mostly Afghanistan, Iraq, choosing to try and find asylum and refuge in European Union member states. As you might know from observing the news or reading the paper, the EU has taken some highly questionable measures to try and prevent people from entering the European Union, including trying to keep people in confinement in what they call the country of first entrance, which is usually Greece, or in the case of people arriving from North Africa and through Libya in Italy, or to keep them outside of the European Union altogether and pay countries like Turkey to actually keep people in confinement or send them back to Syria altogether. In 2016, and I keep updating these figures, more than, when I first wrote this slide, it was 135,000 people. When I last checked, figures had doubled to 331,000 people had reached Europe, and more than 4,000 people died trying to get into Europe. And 1 in 4 of them is a child. These are up-to-date figures from the UNHCR website. You can check them, and probably these have gone up as we speak. So this is the context the macro-political context for that has changed dramatically for our work. I think this is important because the idea that the right to inclusive, culturally and locally appropriate early childhood education and what we do to ensure this is no longer a question that's relevant for so-called developing countries. Rosa Parvati, the Italian theorist and writer, talks about the blurring of boundaries between center and periphery. And I think that's what we see happening around us. And one of the implications for this, and this is one argument that I keep making, is that countries in Europe, in North America, in the so-called Western world urgently need to learn from interesting, forward-looking initiatives in so-called developing countries, including Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, and many others, who are developing very interesting and actually effective initiatives to engage with questions of marginalization, questions of exclusion in a way that's very different to what we see in Europe. Here's Rosa Parvati again, talking about the situation Europe finds itself in, struggling with multiculturalism, increasing racism and xenophobia, and this is exactly what we experience in the UK at the moment. After the Brexit referendum, that could be another seminar, but a context, a climate that has changed completely after what was supposed to be a referendum about the economic relationships with a body like the European Union has turned into something that has made open racism permissible overnight in the streets and on buses and on trains. It is really difficult to actually describe what's going on there. Rosa Parvati reminds us that it might be important in this context to shift the focus of our attention from the differences between different cultures, us and them, to the actual differences within. And she says that we can no longer rely on oppositional or dualistic thinking, and it is really about the challenge really is to face complexity and come to terms with complexity, which is something that we've been saying in early childhood for some time. But it's talking about possible new alliances, and there are some theoretical ones that we need to keep in mind. Let's look at some of the workings of what Gilles Deleuze calls the desiring machine. He never talks about early childhood, but I think it's quite apt to use this concept. Looking at policy, the European Union has had an interesting relationship with young children over the years. There have been some rather high-profile policy developments and policy documents in the European Union since the early 1990s, which in a way seems quite puzzling, because the European Union as an organization that brings together today 29 sovereign member states has no powers whatsoever to influence or to rule into education or early childhood education or childcare in the member states. But there has been a long history of policy documents. I'm not going to go through them in great detail. My argument today is that it's interesting to look at the changes in language and terminology used in these documents. In one of the first documents in 1992, when a then much smaller European Union came together, they issued what they called the Council recommendations on childcare. And in this document, they say it's really important for European Union member states to invest in childcare, because our overall strategic plan is to turn the European Union into the most competitive economic environment of the world by 2010, the so-called Lisbon strategy. And in order to do that, you want to increase women's participation in the labor market. In order to do that, you need to provide childcare places. It was pretty straightforward. It was never about children. It was about a macroeconomic argument and childcare as a tool to achieve much broader, ambitious policy goals. And they talk about childcare services. What's interesting is that over during the 1990s, early 2000s, there was a shift in terminology. You could see children sort of creeping into the picture. It was all sorts of interesting discussions internationally, underpinned by research, but also political discussions. And all of a sudden, all of the important EU policy documents talk about early childhood education and care. There's no childcare anymore. We talk about early childhood education and care, hyphenated. And the documents, there's always a footnote explaining that education and care are seen as inseparable, which is quite interesting, this shift. And a lot of us have been part of pushing this development and arguing for it. And we've been arguing for the educational importance and the educational nature of our relationship with young children, and for the right to education from the beginning. I think this is interesting, not just because the move away from child care as a service, as a commodity for working parents, but also because it is a move towards, and I'm quoting Martin Woodhead here, it's a move away from the individual child that has to be cared for and looked after, to an entire critical period in human life that has become problematic and has sort of moved into the focus of policy. It's not the child that has to be cared for, it's early childhood in its entirety that has moved into the focus of attention. All good so far. But there's another change happening as we speak. If you look at some of the more recent documents that have come out of the European Union last year, or beginning maybe 2014 or so, all of a sudden care begins to disappear from the picture. The more recent policy documents talk about early childhood education, not about early childhood education and care. And it's sort of placed in the context of a lifelong learning agenda. It's about education. It's about early childhood as the first stepping stone in a lifelong education journey. And Kathleen Lynch, professor at the School of Social Justice at University College Dublin, who's written and researched a lot about this, she writes about our move towards what she calls a careless society, and she asks about the contributions of the education system in actually producing a careless society. Despite all these changes, early childhood is still seen as a key tool to achieving very ambitious and very broad policy goals. So there is a lens sort of onto our practice, onto our profession, which I think is important to keep in mind. Sometimes when you engage with practitioners, and you still sometimes get this feeling that we don't really want to be a political discipline or profession, because there's a lot of attention to actually doing things with children and families and communities. But even if you choose to not to take a political standpoint, it's happening around you. There's no escape. Sorry. so you better be aware of it. A lot of us, including, I would say, my guess would be many of us in this room, have been part of this argument in different arenas. And we've argued for the right to education in the broadest sense from birth. And we were busy explaining what we mean by education in the broadest sense. We were busy talking about education that encompasses all dimensions of human development, that is about unfolding a child's full potential, that is not just about sort of school readiness. But unfortunately, and this is, I think, I'm not a linguist, but, so I'm happy to have a discussion about this. Unfortunately, we see a definition of education prevail in policy documents and in the broader discourse that is extremely narrow. And my guess is, my theory is that this is actually down to a very narrow understanding of what education might mean in the English language context. And this discourse that we see at the moment is constantly reinforced by, I call them global agents of neoliberalism here, including the European Union, the OECD, the World Bank, and increasingly philanthro-capitalist initiatives, mostly coming out of the USA. Organizations that have very little or no democratic accountability whatsoever. The question for us is, if we step outside of the English language and the limitations of the English language, we find that, and these are only very few examples, that the French concept of éducation, for instance, comes with very different connotations to the English understanding of education. The German understanding of Bildung as the humanist concept of unfolding a person's full potential with the contribution of that person in doing this is something completely different to a sort of an understanding of schooling somebody. The Spanish context of educación, again, comes with different connotations. And adding the Portuguese educação, because that is Paulo Freire's language when he writes about education as a political practice, as a practice of transformation and liberation. So what we see, isn't that my concern, that increasingly differences, diversity, and diversity is always linked to questions of inequality. Increasingly, these differences we see as framed as in terms of educational achievement gaps, defined in a very narrow way. And increasingly, they are documented and evidenced through standardized assessment procedures. And this is coming towards us. Yeah. My guess would be, I'm not too familiar with the New Zealand context, but my guess would be that somewhere in New Zealand policy context, there will be a document that has the title Closing the Gap. Yeah. What we see in the European policy context is we have quite a number of these documents that talk about closing the achievement gap between children from marginalized communities and the dominant groups in society. What we see is, and this goes back to the first slide, to the voices of the father and the teacher in Croatia, that 20 years of attempts to close the gap by promoting, and that's another quote from these policy documents, increased participation in early childhood education and care, hasn't really changed the life situation and the real life experience of the most marginalized children. So the question is, what are we doing promoting ever same policy responses to life experiences of children and families, are we putting ourselves, are we suggesting a more of the same approach? Are we caught in a more of the same trap? Because inevitably the answer you get when you say, so what's the solution for this father and this child? Somebody will say, we need to provide more education, early child education and care. We hardly ever ask the question whether the kind of early child education and care we provide might actually contribute to keeping that gap wide open, because it reinforces cultural differences, it reinforces a dominant way of knowing, learning, and doing, and it privileges one way of being in this world over others. Let's move from the European Union onto more global scale. This is something that you find impacting on developments in a number of so-called developing countries. The World Bank has turned itself into one of the major global players when it comes to shaping education policies and practices in many countries. And they have a strategy. There's a document that's freely available on their website. You can look it up, and it's called Learning for All, Investing in People's Knowledge and Skills to Promote Development. First of all, that's another topic for a seminar. What's in a title? What's in a name? It does give some hints towards what learning, what education is about, viewed through the lens of the World Bank. So it is about learning, it is about investment, which leads to the question of return on investment, question mark, and it has a purpose. It's not about the here and the now, it's about something to promote development, whatever that might be. It's interesting to read this document, and it's a document that claims to outline the strategy, the education strategy of the World Bank, covering early childhood through to higher education. If you do a quick and rough search of this document, you will find that there is a link. There's some, the human rights and children's rights are mentioned, but merely in passing. And it makes an immediate connection between the right to education and a private sector involvement in providing that education. A document that claims to be the underpinning orientation for including early childhood education at the World Bank. Such a document, it's quite interesting to see that the concept of play is completely absent. It doesn't appear in this document. The idea of diversity in relation to education, nul point, doesn't appear. Democracy is obviously a concept that, through the eyes of the World Bank, has nothing to do with education, because it doesn't appear in this document. But on the 112 pages of this document, you will find 107 mentions of the term assessment. I admit this is not a thorough content analysis of this document, but I would encourage you to look it up, because it does give some indication of how the World Bank sees education. Why is this important? There are some well-documented examples from, and here's some African examples, of the implications and consequences of World Bank involvement in shaping countries' education policies. Tanzania in the 1980s had a fairly developed public school system. The way things operate when countries begin to rely on World Bank funding for development is that the money is offered conditional to countries adopting what the bank calls structural adjustments. And these structural adjustments are usually about opening the public sector to private participation, privatizing services, decreasing job security and wages for teachers, for instance, and in the context of education, opening the education sector to private for-profit providers. The experience in Tanzania was that after the country agreeing to these structural adjustments, enrollment rate in preschool, in primary school, that is, dropped sharply from almost 100% to 70%. That was the late 1980s. You might think, since all this is documented, people might have learned from this. But if you look at recent data from 2016, you see exactly the same thing happening in countries like Uganda, Ghana, Malawi, where again the World Bank opens a country up in terms of structural adjustments only for private, for-profit international corporations to come in. And there's a particular interesting development between a corporation called Pearson, which is the biggest global education and assessment provider, who are the owner of another company, which is called Bridge International Academies, who are now in Uganda, for instance, offering what they call low-fee paying private schools, supported by World Bank funds. The idea being that the country is not in a position to provide free and public education for all. This is why you need the involvement of the private sector. There's no discussion about how that might be, that a country is left in a position that is not able to provide public education for everybody, or water supply, or healthcare. So Bridge International Academies offering low fee paying private schools. The low fee is of course much lower than what you would expect to pay for private education in Europe or North America. But it still amounts to about 40 to 70% of the income for a poor family. And as an immediate consequence, and all this is documented, families are pushed into having to make really hard choices, and the choices they make is that when there are several children, they pay for the boy child to be educated, and the participation rates of girls is dropping. So that's context. There are other ways of imagining early childhood policies. This is an example from Colombia. Very interesting Latin American country. There are some interesting developments happening in Latin America in several countries, including Colombia, Uruguay, Chile, where countries are beginning to reclaim early childhood as a public responsibility, and they're very, very vocal about it. And Colombia, for instance, has published this policy framework. It's called Tesar Siempre, from zero to always. And what's interesting about this is, first of all, how it's framed. It is about early childhood, but it looks at early childhood from a much broader human development lens. And it is about education. They are concerned about early childhood education, but they're also concerned about questions of health, salud, of social cohesion, of equality, and in the case of Colombia, of course, now in this process of rebuilding a country after the conflict with the FARC, a peace and society building project. This is much broader than the question of, can we think childcare and early education together in one setting? This is really about sort of early childhood in its broadest sense. The second thing that's important about the Colombian approach, and you would find similar policies in Uruguay, for instance. The second thing that's important about it is that it's not just a nice document, because that's easy enough, you can sort of write a document. It's also a policy strategy. So the Colombian government has introduced well aware of the pitfalls of different government departments like health and education and welfare and all the squabbling for resources. They've taken all this out of these departments. They've created an independent interdepartmental group. They've taken money away from the different government ministries. The group is chaired at a very high level by, it was created by the President of the Republic, is chaired by the First Lady at the moment. And this group is responsible for implementing this. And Colombia is rolling out this massive program of what they call Centros de Desarrollo Infantil, early childhood development centers, which are basically community hubs that work with local communities to support families in all these areas around children. So there are ways of looking into this that are very different from the narrow understanding of the World Bank, for instance, what early education might be. There's a very clear understanding, and I'm always, I'm no longer surprised, but when I first started working in countries like Colombia and Uruguay, I was very surprised about the political debate around it. When we first submitted a proposal to the Colombian government around this framework, and we said, actually, because they asked us, would we work with them around workforce issues, and they asked us to basically outline our position, where we came from when it comes to sort of looking at professional practice in early childhood. And we were quite courageous, so we said our sort of starting position is that early childhood professional practice is always political practice, it's always relational, and it's always sort of an uncertain practice. And I was pretty sure that we would get some questions around that. Imagine sending a research proposal to the European Union saying early childhood is political practice. And you probably wouldn't get very far in this process. They looked at our proposal and they said, so what? It was not a question. It's broadly accepted that what we do is a political practice, which doesn't mean that there's arguments and struggles and disagreements. But this whole notion of education and the responsibility for the youngest children in society is a public good, and a public responsibility is broadly accepted, which is interesting. So, this is Colombia as well. This is an email from an email I had from a friend and colleague in Colombia. She works at one of the universities. She's very much involved in developing these policies in Colombia, and she shall not be named. And she was invited to attend a meeting that was called by the OECD and the Ministry of Education to discuss Colombia's early childhood policies. And these are her notes that she sent me after the meeting. There is an enormous push on countries, and Colombia is only one example, and you shouldn't be too surprised if it comes to New Zealand next. There's an enormous push by organizations like the OECD to abandon these holistic public policies and to move towards very narrow, standardized assessment frameworks that lead into international league tables. What did surprise me that at a public meeting in 2016, it can be said that children are wasting their time with play, arts, and literature. Well, that's obviously the spirit. And it continues. So there is this attempt to pull countries into an international, global framework of standardized assessment, which has very little space for locally and culturally appropriate developments and understandings and imaginings of what early childhood could be in a society. The OECD, who's doing this at the moment, is an interesting organization, and she has undergone some quite interesting conceptual changes as well. If you look at the first reports, first studies on early childhood that came out of the OECD in 2001 and 2006, the Starting Strong 1 and 2 reports, this is how they talk about the recommendations they give to countries. They recommend countries to have standards, investment in early childhood, but they talk about the process being participatory in the way you define and ensure the quality. They talk about this being a democratic process that involves different groups, including children, families, parents, practitioners, consultation with stakeholders, curricula that focus on the norms and values in the particular countries, and assessment and monitoring processes that involve multiple perspectives. In 2012, the OECD published a follow-up document, Starting Strong 3, which is a complete sort of turn, because all of a sudden we're talking about a quality toolbox. We're no longer talking about participatory processes, we're no longer talking about different perspectives and things that are in relation to local understandings of what early childhood is about. We talk about a toolbox. And in 2015, Starting Strong 4 talks about monitoring and quality. So it's no longer about a collaborative process of actually imagining and developing and producing quality, but the importance shifts to how can we measure this. And right now, the OECD is preparing and proposing what they call the International Early Learning Study, which is basically a preschool PISA. And they're open about this. So they suggest, they encourage countries to take part in an exercise that would externally assess in a standardized way learning outcomes for children as young as 4. And they say in time, this information will then eventually feed into the wider PISA framework. So what we're seeing is a development that brings together assessment, standardized assessment at an international level for 4-year-olds, for 15-year-olds in higher education, because that's what the OECD does as well, and in a project that's called PISA for Development, which extends the PISA framework to so-called developing countries. So we see a shift from democratic accountability through technocratic management to a much stronger focus on outcome and investment. And the question is, does it stop there? And I don't think it does. Because if you go to the various websites, what you find is that there is now an open connection between the OECD and the PISA framework and the aforementioned corporation Pearson, who have been commissioned by the OECD to run large parts of the 2018 PISA. And they're proud about it. You can see it on their website. So there is, and I think that's quite critical for us to understand, on the one hand, we're still engaging in discussions among ourselves about concepts, approaches, what's important. we're also trying to engage in conversations with policymakers. And we're all part of this, and I've been part of this as well, to see how can we find a language, how can we make ourselves heard in policy environments? What do we need to say so that the people in the ministry, in the department, actually can connect to our arguments? But my fear is that we're actually moving, or maybe we have already moved into a post-political and post-conceptual phase where it's actually about big money and not much else. The American business magazine Forbes, you might have seen this a couple of months ago. They ran a title, and the title read the $1 trillion business. And it was all about education, and the argument was that for many global corporations, they've come to realize that areas like health, water supply, nutrition, they've come to something that they call saturation points, where they can't really expand, and the only market that's left is education, and they call it a $1 trillion business. So I think it is about an awareness that we need around this, because this immediately, even if it seems pretty far away, it has immediate implications for the practice on a Tuesday morning in an early childhood setting, including things that are happening here, revisions of the early childhood curriculum in this country. I think it's important to remind ourselves of the risks of all this, and Gerd Biester some years ago wrote about the dangers of the technocratic model that we're introducing in education. And again, it is linked to what I said earlier about the dictatorship of no alternatives. When we talk about effectiveness and how we measure effectiveness in education, we shouldn't forget that what counts as effective really depends on what we think is desirable and for whom. And Biester again says this whole focus on the question of assessing what works makes it very difficult to ask the question, who should it work for? And who should have a say in all this? So some critical concepts that usually don't appear in the policy context, but I think we need to come back to, is the question of what does it mean to be a child, to live and grow up in our society, locally, but also globally. So you can't really separate this. And in consequence, what's the purpose? How do we understand the purpose of early childhood services? What is our understanding of the relationship between the private, the family, the community, and the public? And going back to the earlier slide, what do we mean by education? Are we talking about school readiness, early literacy, early numeracy, and then a few sort of holistic dimensions around them to support better learning? Because if children are emotionally well, they usually learn better. That's the argument that comes through some of these documents. Or are we talking about education as a political, emancipatory practice of liberation and what that might mean? The fundamental choice, I think, at the moment is really about a policy choice between early childhood services seen as an investment, which takes us down the road of return on investment, human capital questions, the question of how to best manage this, how to assess our successes, how to make sure that there is a accountability, and how do we best provide for this, which is usually through introducing private for-profit providers into the system, or early childhood is seen as a public good, a public responsibility, and the Spanish phrase is from a document in Uruguay, which states early childhood as being a responsibility and for all. Let's look at what and how we might position ourselves in all this. This is a short story from a project that was conducted in Ireland, in Europe, and it's part of an initiative by this organization, the DSET network. DSET is Diversity in Early Childhood Education and Training. And DSET, in DSET, we've encouraged our members to engage in projects with practitioners around questions of diversity. And this particular project was called the Family Wall Project. In this particular service, practitioners invited parents to bring in family photos. It's pretty straightforward. You've done this. It's about bringing in the family photos to start conversations about families and different types of families and diversity. And then this is me with mom and dad, and this is me with my mom and my other mom, and this is me at my mom's home, and this is me at my dad's home. You know, that kind of thing. So they did this in this particular service. They had a child, a little boy, not the child in the picture, who was seen as extremely problematic by practitioners. They couldn't really engage with this child. He would either be withdrawn, or he would be jumping up and down the wall, be extremely disruptive. So they couldn't really connect. He wouldn't talk, and he was set on a trajectory to being diagnosed with all sorts of interesting conditions, Latin names. You know about these trajectories for children. The day the photos came in, and the family of this child brought pictures as well, children like here went up to the wall and started looking at pictures and started talking. And then one child pointed to the photo that the family of this little boy had brought in and said, "There's a horse in your picture. Do you have a horse?" And you could really see it was a moment when the lights went on in the face of the little boy. He said, "We have many horses." And he started talking. And he knew, and it became apparent that he knew everything that there is to know about different types of horses, what they're called, what they use them for, how you care for them, because that's what his family did. It was the first time he had something meaningful to talk about and to contribute. And it was the first time that he could make a meaningful connection between his life in the center and at home. And it was a body of knowledge and experience and wisdom and practice that the practitioners had no idea existed, because it was so outside of their understanding of what knowledge and learning and development was about, that they didn't make that connection. So the question arises is, when we connect in our activities, practices, with children, students, in research, whatever, whose knowledge and experience do we value? What knowledge do we see as relevant and irrelevant? And who decides this? And who is repeatedly and constantly silenced in these processes? Here's another short story, which I borrowed from my friend and colleague John Nazike, who works at Kenyatta University in Nairobi in Kenya. John is a member of the Turkana tribe, a semi-nomadic community in the northern part of Kenya. When he talks about early childhood, he says, this is an early childhood learning environment in our community. Turkana children learn through doing things, through apprenticeship in a way. Early childhood education and learning in early childhood is participatory, it is generative, it's also socially transformative, because it's about children making meaningful contributions to the community from a very early age. And most of all, it says, for Turkana children, early childhood education is learning for survival. What an interesting thought. early childhood education is learning for survival. Looking at the state we find our world in, I think we would be well advised to start thinking about education for survival and learning for survival in many other contexts. Some theoretical and conceptual alliances that we might sort of engage with. Here's Rosa Parvati again talking about the need to engage with and to counter the inertia that, as she calls it, of self-interest in neoconservative thought, and the urgency to find new and alternative modes of political and ethical agency to engage in this. And your own Jenny Ritchie, oh, this is not correct, this should read 2016, it's not in print anymore, it's out, talking about the possibility of re-engaging with an interconnectedness between the spiritual well-being, the community, the physical, the nature, as a possibility to resist what we call normal science in a special edition of a journal that we just brought out, and that's what she's writing in. Or sort of even more in a more general perspective, looking at the contributions of indigenous scholarship, thinking, and practices all around the world that has never really made that distinction, that Cartesian distinction between body and mind and nature and culture, which underpins so much of our understandings of what education is all about. But I promised you Froebel, and so let's talk about Froebel. Froebel, who developed the kindergarten movement in continental Europe and Germany in the 1820s and 30s. This is from his own writing. We do remember him as the inventor of these funny blocks, the Froebel gift, but he was actually a quite interesting thinker. And this is his take on children and their development. He's talking about connectedness. He's talking about the child attributing life to everything around him. And he talks about the connections between, or the manifold developments of life. He talks about the child in relation to the family. He talks about the child in relation to the community and to what he calls a higher invisible being. So there's a spiritual dimension, there's a natural, there's a connectedness to nature, to society, to spirituality, and all of this is seen as having life as much as the child's life. This is Froebel writing in 1826, and I think this offers quite an interesting possibility for a new alliance between ways of knowing, being, and doing in many parts of the world and in history that counter the very narrow and in a way minority world discourse about early childhood education that has colonized our field. And I think we should have these conversations. But Froebel is important not just because he sort of offers a connection to what indigenous thinkers and practitioners are telling us. He's also interesting for another reason, and I'm trying to draw this all to a close. We know this. Froebel talks about his pedagogical principles, the uniqueness of each child's capacity. He has, as we've seen, a very holistic view of childhood and child development. He talks about childhood as something with an integrity in its own right, and all this. And he talks about the importance of play, of course, which is ever more important when we read a document like the World Bank education strategy that doesn't even care to mention education in play in relation to education. But he's important for this as well. Froebel's thinking didn't just appear out of the blue. He developed his practices, his writing, and his thinking in the context of a very concrete social and cultural and political environment. And the environment in the early 1800s in continental Europe was one of upheaval, revolution, and resistance. People demanding civil rights, people trying to establish a democratic republic against the kingdoms and fiefdoms and empires of the time. People taking up armed resistance, and what you usually don't find in the textbooks, Froebel himself was part of one of the free corps, and he fought with a musket in his hand for the Democratic Republic. So there were revolutions happening all over what was then sort of German-speaking part of continental Europe. In 1848, there was 1849 it was, the Revolutionary Parliament met in Frankfurt in Germany in the Paulskirche. One of the things, delegates from all over the continent, one of the things they discussed and debated was an act that called for universal access to kindergarten. Because they said, if you want a democratic society, what you want is education for all from an early age, which is Friedrich Froebel's underpinning of idea of early child education. He also said, and he practiced it, Froebel, that if you want this sort of high-quality education for all and for young children, you need highly qualified, well-educated professionals to do this. So his kindergarten was an educational institution for women. And many of the women who worked with Froebel then went on to become the first female university graduates in the 1850s and 60s and 70s in Germany. That was pretty radical at the time. He also talked about things like education being a public responsibility, something that could be done and thought outside of the church and the state. Well, it's a little surprise, but the revolution didn't really succeed. And in the early 1850s, the Prussian state basically took over, created a unified Germany, but not a democratic republic. That was not to happen. But one of the first things they did in 1852, they banned Froebel's kindergarten. They did not ban working with young children or looking after young children. They specifically banned Friedrich Froebel's kindergarten for being atheist, socialist, outright dangerous. And I think that's an important root and an important cornerstone of our profession that we need to remember. That education and early childhood education is dangerous. It bloody well is. And I think we should be proud of this. One of the reasons why I talk to you tonight is that many of the women who worked with Froebel were forced into emigration following that ban. And off they went to Scotland, to Argentina, to New Zealand, to the US, to Canada, to many other places, taking their ideas with them. So I think that's enough now. I just want to sort of bring it full circle to another important figure in our field who has been who popped up sort of in the margins several times, Paulo Freire, who reminds us that engaging in all this, and especially this being a university, people engaging in research and in scholarship around this, is not in itself going to change the world. But we do provide the basis and a new understanding and possible new understanding for people to better engage in this struggle for a transformation and the oppressive conditions that we find. And I think that's as much as I have for you now. Thank you. over time.
With some critical moments of discussion, which I have been given the responsibility of getting us going with. And I'd like to localise it in relation to what we're calling here the communities of learning. So the Ministry of Education is very interested in a networked community approach to meeting educational objectives in this country. And so they set up the communities of learning as an approach of forming a community and then advocating to the ministry for funding around a particular achievement objective. And at the moment, the communities of learning are focused on funding primary and secondary leaders to be released from their roles in order to get together and just decide what would the achievement objectives be, how will they measure them, and then if the objectives are attractive to the ministry, then what they'll do is they'll fund them. I'm breaking it into a very small and crass explanation. When asked why there was no release for early childhood education, there hasn't really been much of an answer other than the possibility that early childhood education is dangerous for the meeting of secondary school achievement objectives.
There you have it.
Right, and when you understand what dangerous means, it means that it's a numbers game. It's community of learning is made up of 1 or 2 secondary schools, a number of primary schools that feed those secondary schools. If they allow early childhood to be pushed into this discussion about what achievement might mean, then you've got 100, maybe more early childhood centres contributing to the debates around what the purpose of the community of learning is about. So when asking the question, what counts and who counts, it's quite clear to the ministry that it can't cope with the possibility that early childhood education counts. Early childhood education is dangerous. So your talk here, I think, is critically important to take to the ministry and to take to the communities of learning as they set themselves up, in order for them to take seriously what it is that they're agreeing to and the impact it will have on early childhood education in this country. I'll just stop there in terms of the relevance. And yeah, I think people would be interested in asking questions. Unless you want to discuss more communities. Well, one other thing, when talking about communities of learning, is that the ministry's now also not just removed the word care from the discourse around early childhood education, it's also removed early childhood education. So now we are in the early learning services sector, and when talking with the ministry, they will correct themselves if they start talking about early childhood education as a sector.
But the answer is always this 42. No, but I don't think there is a straightforward answer to that. But I think 2 things are important. First of all, as you say, we have to be aware that what's happening in and around early childhood, it doesn't happen in isolation. There's a much broader sort of environment in which all these developments unfold, and they extend in education at least through all the tiers of the education system: early childhood, compulsory education, higher education. That's one thing. In this context, it's also important to be aware of how education systems in the neoliberal climate change and how they move from supporting collaboration to incentivizing a competition, which makes, as you will know, higher education an extremely difficult place to work. And it has implications, and not just for higher education, but also for how we engage as academics, as researchers, with wider communities, with others, because it's all, we're only rewarded for making outstanding contributions where we sort of figure prominently. We're not rewarded for collaboration. So that's part of this connection between early childhood and higher education. Part of the solution, I think, I would hope, and I'm trying to organize a bit of this at the moment with colleagues and friends, is to engage in conversations that are that look at other ways of imagining the relationship between communities and of practice, but also communities out there and children. And this is why I think it's important to go back to the roots of our profession and, for instance, look at some of Froebel's original writing. It has been translated into English, which helps. You might want to try and read the original German, which is very convoluted, but and engage in conversations what that might mean in relationship to people working with First Nations in Canada, in relationship to people trying to set up meaningful programs in Croatia and the children that I mentioned in my first slide, in relation to a Maori way of approaching education as you do in this country. And I think there is a number of alliances that can be brought together that at least come with hope to say something against this dictatorship of no alternatives. And theoretically, I think that's the third angle. I think it's very important to engage with thinkers outside of our immediate field. And this is why people who bring in post-humanist and new materialist thinking are so useful to engage with, people like Karen Barad and Rosa Parvati and others. So build new alliances. Don't sort of let yourself be pushed into that corner. That would be at least an approach to a solution. It's not the solution.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. And, it's frightening to hear what you statements for sure. We know common knowledge since the 70s and early 80s, the degree to which organizations like the World Trade Organization and the World Bank have been in the business of underdeveloping the underdeveloped world. That's how they make their money. Now they're in the business of undereducating. And not just that world, but also Europe as well, environments. So I'm interested in your, among your global contacts and people, environments that you've visited and spoken to. Apart from the nexus of global capital and state governmentalities, what smaller, obviously smaller, groups have you encountered who are, it would seem to me, the only option? I know I'm an American in a post-Trump world. What options have you seen for small-scale attempts to simply work outside, off the grid, as it were, of this kind of educational finance rort?
So you came to New Zealand before the election, I would say.
I'm a bushhead.
Yeah.
I thought that was bad.
But, well, talking about what are the groups trying to maintain that, I mean,
You've met very interesting people.
well, just last week, was it last week or the week? the week before, we had a conference here in New Zealand, a group of people who try to and do exactly this, come together from their various local activities in the academy, but also as activists, as practitioners. It's a group called Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education. It's a group that originated in the US at a time when the mainstream discourse was about a very narrow understanding of what they call developmentally appropriate practices, focusing on only one understanding of what it means to grow up, which would then be sort of rolled out globally in early childhood programs. This community was very much a community of resistance against this mainstream. It is still very much active. We just had a wonderful conference last week here in New Zealand.
Do any of those people, have they opened centers?
Some of them, yeah. Some of them do. Yeah, yeah.
Like, what centers have you encountered? People who have actually cobbled together, some capital created these spaces that don't rely on world banks, don't rely on WTOs, don't rely on state.
We see interesting initiatives emerging in countries like Kenya. We see political initiatives emerging in Latin America. We see neighborhood initiatives emerging in Brooklyn, where people try and do exactly that, and they work out of sort of anti-discriminatory, anti-bias practices where they work towards social justice. And it is really about creating spaces and forums for bringing this together, because one of the things is that we see early childhood practice is inevitably very local practice. I mean, there's hardly a practice that's more local than educating and caring for young children. But the issues that we're facing, even though they're local, they are connected on a global scale. And we're faced with this global steamroller that comes in the shape of standardized assessment and standardized programs, standardized understandings of what all this is about. And in order to engage critically with this and to resist and set something against it, we need to connect our little local dots. And there are some networks and organizations, including DSET, including Ritchie, including some others, that do exactly that.